Welcome everyone, I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. This live stream is entitled Paul Ricoeur on Meaning and Metaphor, asking the question, how does meaning mean? How does meaning become meaningful for us human subjects? Thinking about this through the method of phenomenology and Paul Ricoeur's hermeneutical phenomenology, in continuity yet contrast with that phenomenology of givenness in Husserl, Heidegger, Jean-Luc Marion, and others. So Paul Ricoeur, we see a movement from the givenness to meaning in Ricoeur's phenomenology, a movement from the simple as gibt of a phenomenon, you say it in German, meaning in English it gives as gibt, it gives as gibt. In Ricoeur is moving to an S gibt als. And this little word makes so much difference in Ricoeur, which would mean in English it gives as. This is what's called the phenomenological as. That's really inaugurated, especially by Heidegger, and its greater concern over the hermeneutics of experience, not just given phenomena themselves. So a combination of the Esgipt and the Esgipt aus gives us a fuller picture of phenomenology. What more could we say? The Esgipt, Paul Ricoeur talks about as an event, and Esgipt aus also as an event, but they're two distinct events within lived experience. This specifically, the Esgipt would be the event of manifestation, the self-showing of the phenomenon. In Esgipt aus is the event of interpretation of the manifestation that we call meaning. So twofold eventfulness within lived experience for Paul Ricoeur. The movement of the Esgipt to the Esgipt aus. And again, Ricoeur says that manifestation and meaning are contemporaneous with each other within experience and reciprocal. So much manifestation, so much meaning, and so much meaning, so much manifestation. These things work together. So meaning helps manifestation light up all the more. And manifestation gives interpretation something to do, and it becomes productive of meanings. So this generative movement of givenness and interpretation, manifestation, and meaning in Paul Ricoeur. So in this live stream, we want to think together about meaning as generated through symbol and metaphor within language. So as Heidegger said, language is the house of being, and we might wonder about the architecture of this house. For Paul Ricoeur, elements of the architecture like symbol and metaphor are what hold the entire edifice together and make it have character, make it very interesting and meaningful. So let's think together with Paul Ricoeur about symbol and metaphor. Ricoeur's hermeneutical theory. What we have here is a recognition of double meanings within a singular phenomenon, where living symbols and metaphors perpetually are pregnant with meaning insofar as they maintain their genius of double meanings. They bear fruitful potential to generate new meanings and paradigms for understanding reality, as long as they are not reduced to a single univocal literal meaning. So both symbol and metaphor refract univocity by means of their opacity. Symbol and metaphor mean more than they meant. They mean one thing, and then another, and then another, and then another. The dynamism of symbol and metaphor is to mean in a saturating capacity and way, and to continue to generate new meanings. So this is why in human experience, symbols and metaphors never seem to grow old. They renew their vivacity through generating new meanings to new generations of people. For Ricoeur, symbol and metaphor appear at the heart of his hermeneutics, as they themselves are instances par excellence of ways in which meaning is made. So, first, it is necessary to provide working definitions of symbol and metaphor as they appear in the work of Ricoeur. While both symbol and metaphor are considered double meaning expressions, as he calls them, metaphor functions solely in the linguistic realm, whereas symbol brings together two dimensions. And this is quoting from Ricoeur's book, Interpretation Theory. Symbol brings together two dimensions, we might even say two universes of discourse, one linguistic, the other of a non-linguistic order. So let's think about that together. The symbol, the etymology from Greek, the Greek etymology of the term symbol, symbalein. What does Ricoeur mean about these double meaning expressions? And in the case of the symbol, two different dimensions are brought together, two different worlds. So symbalein, Greek verb, symbalein, from balein, to throw, to cast, to launch, together, united. Cymbaline, where we get the English word symbol, to throw together, to crash together. It's kind of like a parabola, where we have these two distinctive worlds coming together, merging together in the intersection of the base. This is where the symbol happens, like this. So, as Ricoeur says, two dimensions, two universes of discourse, one of a non-linguistic order, and the other of a linguistic order. So this corresponds to what we we're just talking about, with the difference between the exgipt, which would be of the non-linguistic order, and the exgipt als, which belongs to the linguistic order. Again, this is the order of manifestation and givenness. This is of the order of meaning and metaphor, language, proclamation, interpretation, manifestation and meaning, givenness, interpretation. So the symbol is a phenomenon that brings these two universes together, the non-linguistic or the pre-linguistic and the linguistic. This is very important for phenomenology. So for phenomenology, we're very interested in phenomena like symbols because they're too elusive for empiricism and every kind of objectivism. There's something born of spirits here that exceeds an interpretation to the periodic table of elements alone. For instance, So when we're talking about the phenomenality of symbol, we have givenness and meaning, which can't be reduced to things made up of atoms. Already the phenomenon of symbol is evidence of divinity, evidence of the otherwise than matter, as what may really matter in the end. Phenomenology is gathering up this evidence of explication, as Ricoeur says, and the explication of evidence, manifestation and meaning together. So, the symbol functions to its full degree insofar as it first operates metaphorically, for the symbol in effect only gives rise to thought if it first gives rise to speech, Ricoeur says, in interpretation theory. So the relationship between thought and speech, givenness, thought, speech. Again, as he puts it, that the symbol only gives rise to thought if it first gives rise to speech. And to give rise to speech is to give rise to language. So we think linguistically. When we think, when we know, when we understand, there's a linguistic structure. We call it epistemology. How we know, how we think, it is linguistic. It is through speech that we think. For instance, take the example of a term, cathedra. I'll just use a Latin term, cathedra. So we're speaking in English, we're thinking in English, and then we're going to pull in a term from a different language, which is, again, helpful to better understand language and how it works, how interpretation works. So we have to interpret a word from another language. We'll take the example of cathedra, where we get the English word cathedral. And what is a cathedral within Christianity? It is where the cathedra of the bishop is. What's the cathedra of the bishop? The chair. So already we're getting multiple meanings, layers of meaning within this hermeneutics of cathedra. So in English, we could say this could be a word for chair. We could translate it chair. We also could translate it seat, the place upon which one sits, a distinctive place. We could also translate it in a certain context, throne. And when we start using language of throne, it's not just an ordinary place to sit, it's an extraordinary one for a monarch, for someone in power, someone in authority. So phenomenology, this hermeneutical phenomenology, takes a word phenomenon like cathedra and is very interested to get into its etymology, to get into all of its possible translations, all these resonances and harmonics of meaning within the singularity of the word, the term. Phenomenologists love this work, love this mining of meaning that is hermeneutics. So when we're dealing with words like this, we have multiple meanings going on. And so cathedra can be used as a word to designate a physical object there. Yet the word designates much more than an instance of a physical chair. It signifies, for instance, in Christianity, the office, identity, jurisdiction, power, teaching authority, etc. of the bishop, of the leader in the community, who teaches, governs, and sanctifies within the community. And phenomenology doesn't bat an eyelash at, oh goodness, we're in theological territory. it's all fair game for phenomenology, and we find some of the most interesting phenomena within the realm of theology and religious experience. So we don't hesitate to go there for examples, because within religious experience, it necessitates metaphorical discourse, symbolic discourse, analogical discourse. And here we get at many phenomena of paradox, many saturated phenomena, many more than meets the eye kind of phenomena. And it's great for the phenomenology. So the symbol of the cathedra gives rise to thought. And we say we have a word, but we also could draw a chair as symbol, and it gives rise to thought. If I were to have just drawn this, you probably would not know what it gives. What meaning does this symbol mean, this figure? But when I pair it with the word, even from a different language than I'm speaking, a Latin word, cathedra, I pair it with a word and I translate meanings into English, and then I relate it within a context of interpretation that we're calling Christianity. Let me throw another symbol there called the Chi-Rho, which is the Greek word for Christ, Christos, is the first two letters. Christos. So within the context of Christianity, now the meaning starts to light up. And this is what Ricoeur is getting at. That intersection of manifestation of givenness and meaning results in productivity of meaning, and then ultimately meaningfulness. So this is the process. The symbol functions along the pathway of meaning. We have the manifestation of the chair itself. And if I were trying to showcase this better, I would be pointing to an actual one. I'm not going to point to my office chair here, but I guess we could think about that. A kind of cathedra. Number two, the symbol functions along the pathway of meaning in the second respect as the ensuing naming of the chair as such, the cathedra, and that to which it refers, beyond itself, beyond its literal meaning. So we have chair, but again, within the context of Christianity, the office of the bishop, the authority of the bishop, the administrative capacity of the bishop, the capacitas of the bishop, the headship of the bishop within the community of the local community of the faithful. And this is a process that goes on and on, a process of naming, wherein the literal signification yields to the symbolic signification without dispensing of the literal signification altogether. Even as St. Thomas Aquinas talks about when it comes to sacred texts, there's a primacy of the literal meaning to give us something to hold on to while we're diving deep into the allegorical, spiritual meanings of the text. So the allegorical, the spiritual, the symbolic is always related to the literal, but it's not that the literal, we would say, is more important, but the literal is necessary as a springboard for the phenomenality of symbol, metaphor, analogy, hyperbole, all these different expressions of speech that give much more than a straightforward, prosaic, literal meaning of things. This is a great contrast to analytic philosophy that wants to reduce meaning to the most straightforward expressions as possible and not leave room for symbolic resonance of meaning because it's untamable, it's wild. But continental philosophy loves to breathe in this fresh air of possibility and a multiplication of expression. So the third point then on the pathway of meaning for symbol, therefore, is an unfolding generation of endless exegesis. exegesis, a centrifugal generating outward of meaning from the original concept in every direction. And again, symbol is something that could be a word or a phrase or a poem, but also an object could be a symbol, a drawing, a work of art. Symbol shows up everywhere. The human body itself is symbolic. Um, everything can become a symbol for discourse, for interpretation, and this is very exciting. So the role of the phrase, etc., for example, so we could keep going with this and say another Latin expression, etc., which literally means and others. And others. So these translations, etc., and others, and other ones, etc., is the play of the symbol. Always, etc. Always more where that came from. Always the gift that keeps on giving. Always pregnant with possibility here. The symbol. And what happens with the symbol is an expansive zone of meaning making. It expands according to the etc., according to the ... the ellipsis, the ... And Paul Ricoeur talks about the importance of this, that meaning, the phenomenality of meaning doesn't end with a period, especially when it comes to symbol and metaphor, but the phenomenality of meaning, simply one meaning is differentiated from another by an ellipsis. So we have chair, ... seat, ... throne, ... We continue to let that symbol pump out meaning. A symbol functions insofar as it does not cease in giving meanings without limit. A symbol's meaning is never exhausted, unable to be definitively defined, etc., 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 ... A symbol means ... and more. Fill in the blank. It is like the effect obtained in putting two mirrors face to face, what's called recursive reflection, an infinite explication of meaning between the literal and symbolic significations of a word or an image, even a sound. Like in music, for example, you could have the sound C sharp with a certain hertz sound wave, a certain octave, and C sharp is used in this Beethoven symphony, in this Duke Ellington jazz standard, in this pop music, and so C sharp is a note that can find many venues of expression. And this is how a symbol works: infinite explication of meaning between a literal and symbolic significations around that literal, extending that literal to more than it can mean alone in solitude as just a C sharp. But you could have C sharp, for example, in music in an A major chord and a C sharp minor chord. And you could have it in an augmented A chord. And all these sounds are quite different, but you have the same notes in the mix. The symbol is an instance par excellence of the manifestation, proclamation, dialectic. The symbol lasts as long as the dialectic remains intact, that dialectic between manifestation and meaning, between givenness and interpretation. Manifestation signifies the literal signification of the symbol. For example, the givenness of the chair itself, as well as the givenness of meanings, latent or otherwise, of, as we were talking about, chair, bishop, authority, etc. While proclamation, for its part, signifies the verbal rendering and announcement of meanings generated by the symbol. That is, the linguistic and metaphorical potencies of the symbol. Potencies, this is what phenomenology is after, the possibilities of meaning, the possibilities that can give themselves and be recognized as such through the phenomenological as. So the symbol enters the sphere of meaning only by the gateway of language. Yet not only language, but also testimony for Paul Ricoeur. Whereas, now this is a quote from Ricoeur's book, still Interpretation Theory. Again, I'm taking from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, and just commenting on what I wrote some years ago, and trying to unpack it more in this setting. So Ricoeur writes, whereas metaphor occurs in the already purified universe of the logos, in a very textual universe, already purified by the logos. Like the logos, what he means here, a concept both of Greek philosophy. We also find it within theology, the very word theology. Half the word is from the Greek word logos, theos, logos, science of God, biology, science of life, philology, science of words, meaning. What else? Sociology, science of logos of societas, society, the social phenomena. So when we have logos in operation, we have a movement toward intelligibility, coherence of meaning, language. And this is very important. Otherwise, we can't communicate. We can't know a thing, understand a thing, make sense of a phenomenon. Metaphor, as a concept, is occurring already in the purified universe of the logos, of language and logic, and linguistic meaning making. But the symbol, Ricoeur says, hesitates on dividing the line between bios and logos, life and language. The symbol testifies to the primordial rootedness of what Ricoeur calls discourse in life. It is born where force and form coincide. Whew. Amazing what he's getting at here, where force and form coincide. Again, this is all based on that dialectic that I was talking about earlier in this live stream between es gibt and es gibt als. It gives as. The dialectic between the event of manifestation and the event of meaning. Between givenness and its subjective interpretation by a human subject. And what Ricoeur is also putting in terms here, this is the difference between bios, life, as force, as power, élan vital, this élan vital concept of this surge of life. Michel Henry's essence of manifestation, the autoaffectivity of the flesh, the self-givenness of life, of bios, we could say, moreover, zoe in Greek, life, not just as biological life, talking about cells and mitosis and living bodies of different types, but life as zoe, life as fullness, the possibility of something like resurrection from a bad day, from an injury, from a setback, perhaps even from death itself. So, symbol allows us to cross the thresholds where force and form coincide, where we're not insisting that one be reduced to the other. This is what I call dialectical phenomenology, what Ricoeur is getting at. And we are brought back into this way of experiencing the world by bracketing the natural attitude over and over, and also allowing the play of meaning to obtain and the manifestation of givenness to prevail, where force and form coincide. So symbol doesn't want to demarcate between we have bios over here and logos over here. But the symbol is the intersection of the two. And the force is, for phenomenology, the force of givenness, the force of manifestation. This is what Husserl, Heidegger, and Marion especially are after, this definite phenomenology of manifestation, of aletheia, of self-showing, of a revelation of pre-linguistic givenness first. But then Ricoeur says the interpretation is not so belated in the wake of manifestation, but interpretation itself, this play of meaning, this form where we don't have just force, but an expressive form to coincide with every manifestation of givenness. The symbol grants us the unity, the intersection. So when Jean-Luc Marion is talking about the saturated phenomenon, for instance, the symbol would be a prime example too of a saturated phenomenon that occurs at the intersection of force and form, of bios and logos, of this original discourse in life, but is still a discourse that lights up through the process of interpretation and, moreover, appropriation and attestation. So force signifies the potency of natural symbols, of the cosmos imbued with a surplus of meaning. For examples, natural symbols such as sky, or you might say in Spanish, el cielo, the heavens, uranu in Greek, sky, mountain, sea. These are not just natural phenomena, empirical phenomena. These are symbolic phenomena just as well, if not more, for us interpreting subjects. And the form, in relation to the force, signifies the linguistic transposition of manifest phenomena, that is, the naming of the phenomena for the sake of intelligibility and understanding. For example, this is sky, this is mountain, this is sea. So a pointing out of the givenness, and that language of is here involves a kind of metaphysical interpretation. The nature of this being we call sea, we call mountain, we call sky. But a more pragmatic example, we can go back to that term cathedra. Within the context of a religious experience and within a religious community. And so cathedra, again, can mean all of these things we have here, but also within a Catholic Christian context. The symbol cathedra refers not only to the chair of the bishop, but also the Bishop of Rome, the one called the Pope in the church. And when the Pope would make a dogmatic pronouncement of teaching, of a very definitive doctrine. We have an expression in Catholicism That's called ex cathedra, from the chair. The teaching is made ex cathedra, from the chair. And now we have a redoubled meaning of cathedra, not just in its own symbolism as a word, as a word that we interpret historically through a particularity of cultural contexts. But here we have a specified religious context we'll call Catholicism, and an expression therein, ex cathedra, a teaching made from the chair, means for the Pope to proclaim a point of doctrine that is universally binding and regarded as infallible insofar as it proceeds from the chair, from the seat of authority representing the authority of Christ in his church on earth, made by the Pope, the successor of St. Peter, this Petrine office of leadership, authority, the vicar representative of Christ on earth. So this expression itself bears the meaning of authority and infallibility for the Catholic context. So again, I don't say this. I'm still putting it at arm's reach. I'm not saying it in a preferential way. I'm just saying in a descriptive way, here we have a religious community with a certain symbolic phenomenon happening in terms of meaning, and look at the meaning generated from this phrase, this Latin phrase, ex cathedra, from the chair. So the phrase ex cathedra signals the power of the symbol cathedra. The teaching exhibits potency insofar as the interplay between literal and symbolic significations obtain, insofar as dogma is wedded to the chair of the office of Peter and his successor. Such an act is symbolic due to what Paul Ricoeur calls its rootedness of discourse in life. How so? The act is symbolic in that it proceeds from the power of the sacred that Rudolf Otto talks about in his book, The Idea of the Holy, what's called the numinous power of the sacred, the alterity of divinity. This is an incredible concept for philosophy. The alterity of divinity, the otherness of God, the otherwise than everything, is what is meant, at least one meaning, of divinity. And philosophy cannot be so proud to close itself off to such a saturating meanings, plural. So the alterity of divinity, the otherwise than everything, what Rudolf Otto calls the numinous, the mysterium fascinans et tremendum, the mystery fascinating and terrifying, we call the sacred distinct from the profane. These have two different meanings. There's the sacred and there's the profane. There's something differentiated there that we don't collapse in terms of meaning. Meaning is not ubiquitous. Even the meaning of ubiquity means something else than millions of other meanings. But meaning is not univocal in every instance. We use words that can mean many things, even at once, paradoxically. And this is where the symbol and the metaphor show us the phenomenality of the multiplicity of meanings within interpretation, expression, communication. So back to the ex cathedra example, the act of the Pope proclaiming a teaching ex cathedra, for example, Pope Pius the Ninth's dogmatic proclamation in 1854 of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary is an example. Pope Pius XII's ex cathedra dogmatic proclamation of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary in 1950 is another example. That these dogmatic proclamations are binding for all the Catholic faithful to believe with docility, with trust in the authority of God that comes through Christ, that is extended in and through his vicar on earth, the Pope. Peter, thinking about in Scripture, the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16, you are Peter, on this rock I will build my church. So that Jesus gives him a new name. Simon, he calls in Aramaic Kepha, translated in Greek Petros, and transliterated in English Peter. So phenomenology is great hermeneutics for any field of study. We look at all these layers, we connect the dots, and we're open to what gives and what means. So this ex cathedra, the phenomenon of the Pope of the Catholic Church pronouncing an ex cathedra dogma, involves an appeal to this discourse in life, the power of the sacred, the overwhelming manifestation of, again, what Rudolf Otto calls the mysterium fascinans et tremendum, the life discourse that drives all discourse only to disappear therein. Getting back to Heidegger's disclosedness and concealment of Sein. This we find in every religious experience worthy of the name. There's what Martin Luther called the Deus revelatus, Deus absconditus, the revealed God and the hidden God. What Dionysius the Areopagite, the 6th century Neoplatonic theologian, we have the cataphatic divine naming of God and the apophatic mystical theology through the via negativa. The life discourse through the function of the symbol in the naming, in the semiotics, of divinity, gives both manifestation and unmanifestation, something revealed and something concealed. And whatever is revealed will be an etwas als etwas, something as something, but still there is the ... that lingers into the abyss beyond the horizon of revelation, especially when we're dealing with the concept of divinity. So the life discourse is proclaimed through a metaphorical construal of meaning, one that gives rise to thought, without eclipsing or exhausting the originating power of the life discourse. So when the Pope proclaims a teaching from the chair, ex cathedra, very explicitly and definitively, the office of the Pope, and of any authority for that matter, stems from the authority of life. The authority of biological and zoological forces that ultimately cannot be tamed, mastered, manipulated, measured, fabricated, manufactured, bought and sold. They can't. They're too wild. And in the 21st century, we're positioned as philosophers to deal with the wildness of life like never before. And this wildness beckons us to receive it, be enveloped in it, be enmeshed in its density of manifestation and meaning. Yet authority, most of all ecclesial authority, say within this Catholic context, promises new life through a logical ordering of existence, especially through the play of metaphor. One responds in reverence where one at once looks into abyss and finds security. That is the point of intersection Ricoeur is talking about between force and form. The dialectic between bios and logos, a discourse rooted in the primordial life discourse of being. The symbol itself exhibits a double phenomenality at the intersection between meaning given and meaning made. A perpetual generation of meanings. So this is the symbol within Paul Ricoeur in brief, in a nutshell, a kind of summary of this. And now we want to move to talking about metaphor. How does metaphor relate to symbol? How is it similar yet different? So Paul Ricoeur writes an entire book called The Rule of Metaphor. It's a fantastic work in hermeneutical philosophy, linguistics. Again, Paul Ricoeur, as a philosopher, is willing to take the long route in all these various fields of study beyond his trained expertise, and he gains expertise through all these interdisciplinary dialogues. So in his book, The Rule of Metaphor, Ricoeur gives a topography of the operation of symbol and metaphor, especially emphasizing the relationship between the verbal and the nonverbal, what we've been talking about this whole live stream. Ricoeur takes up the notions of verbal icon, the sense of seeing as, and that's bringing together manifestation and meaning in these phrases. Verbal icon, seeing as. And these notions were advanced already in the work of Marcus B. Hester. So Paul Ricoeur is taking a lot from the work of Hester. In the work of Hester, a disciple of Wittgenstein, the verbal icon functions to produce imaginative possibilities of seeing as. Okay, this is incredibly profitable for post-traumatic experiences in life, because the problem with trauma is that it can lock us in to a paralysis of the past. But instead, what we have with this seeing as is a rehabilitation of the capacity to imagine life new, to imagine life different, to imagine a kind of givenness that can set me free from the tomb of trauma. This is very beneficial. It's a real philosophical payoff. The imaginative possibilities of seeing as, which means we're not frozen looking at the head of Medusa toward the west, but through an adorientive movement, we turn to the east and await the morning star and the rising of the sun. That will not be too delayed in their coming. We await through the seeing as the imaginative possibilities of meaning, the resurrection of meaning, the resurrection of that discourse of life that Ricoeur is talking about. But we must undergo the conversion and face east, ad orientem, to await the epiphany of meaning. Ricoeur comments that for Hester, poetic language, ruled as it is by the metaphor, is that language game, to use Wittgenstein's term, in which the aim of words is to evoke, arouse images. There's a poetics of the East. In this conception, reading becomes a suspension of all reality and an active openness to the text. Have you ever read a book, especially a work of fiction, because there's so much nonfiction communicated in fiction, yes? You ever read a book where it's lifting you into this whole new universe of meaning, of experience, and you delight in it? You delight in this adventure, and so you continue to read page after page, and you get to the end of the book, and it's that bittersweet feeling. I've gotten to the end, but I so much enjoyed that adventure that this author took me on. And not just the author, but the text itself, through a distanciation from the authorial intention. And now it's new meaning made in my hands, in my mind, in my imagination. So this active openness to the text allows this poetic language to have its way, becoming iconic insofar as its reading is characterized by suspension and openness, resulting in a hermeneutic without boundaries. Poetic language opens the way for interpreting the ambiguous, in which the metaphorical is accompanied by the literal is not. Okay, so to take the example we've been working with of the cathedra itself literally means, let's just say chair. In English, the Latin word means chair. Chair means chair, a tautology. I'm sitting in one. Okay, who would deny the connection of the concept to the percept? This is a chair. That's the literal meaning. A chair, often of overly objectified meaning. But the metaphorical is going to do more with the chair than the chair can do by itself. In the case of this religious context, in the use of the term cathedra, where we get the English word cathedral, chair means much more than chair. Again, it means authority, office within the community, the one who has been tasked with teaching. It means, the teacher, the chair symbolizes the teaching, the authority, all of these things within that context through the metaphorical is. This is a chair. At the same time, this is not a chair. The authority is not a chair. The office of bishop is not a chair. The ex cathedra dogmatic proclamation of truth is not a chair. But the chair is functioning metaphorically within the language to allow there to be that renaissance, that new birth of meaning. So this metaphorical is plays off the is not. Time is a healer. It's a metaphor. Because on one hand, time per se is not a healer. Time is time, which doesn't tell us anything. Time is a healer. Time is a healer. Really, that's what I mean. I could say more about that. So over the course of time, wounds heal. So we might say something like time is a healer. But it's a metaphor in that the copula has a double meaning. Both is and is not. So when we use is and we connect the subject to the predicate, time is a healer. We're at once saying time is not a healer, literally, but figuratively, time is a healer. A production of meaning obtains. So this seeing as that Ricoeur is talking about draws from a storehouse of images from one's own history and lived experience, and new meanings that are being generated every day in order to aim at a sensible configuration of the ambiguous phenomenon. So the verbal becomes the vassal of the nonverbal. Okay, so to take, again, this within a Catholic context of ex cathedra, we're talking about in relation to a bishop. This could be very strange from looking in from the outside. You see a man with a strange pointed hat and like a shepherd's crozier, this mitre. You see him already using language to make sensible what seems strange and foreign and unusual and, alien, otherworldly. The liturgical costuming, the vestments, the ring, the cathedra, all of these, they're acting as symbols. They're functioning as symbols within the religious context, much better than if the man just wore a t-shirt and shorts, or even a suit with a sport coat and tie. But when the man wears a distinctive garb, it's lighting up the semiotics of how he's functioning and who he is within the community, within this particular religious community. So, more precisely, we could say that this seeing as, in the case of analogy, involves a referential metaphysical movement from the visible to the invisible. And this is why in this book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist, to investigate another religious phenomenon called Eucharist in Catholicism and Christianity, that approaching the phenomenality of the sacrament is helpful by starting with, not reducing to, but starting with the phenomenality of symbol and metaphor as a way to make sense, as a way to comprehend the logic of what is happening in this event between the manifestation and the meaning. So, in such a schema of the seeing as, we could say, as with Ricoeur, the circle of the heliotrope, that is the sun, predominates the metaphorical discourse. The movement and the positioning of the sun as light, the invisible yet visible phenomenon that makes all else appear, that gives growth and ultimately drives all biological processes in Earth. The sun serves as a prime symbol, or linguistically as a metaphor, sun, serves as a fitting model for the dual phenomenality of the metaphor involving both a natural given meaning and a host of responsorial meanings. The sun performs as an integral phenomenon of nature, but further lends itself as a locus of meaning making due to its central role in our solar system. So, in its light, we see everything else. Without the sun, only darkness, nothing to see, and metaphorically, no seeing as. So, if we use the sun within the play of metaphor within the poem, for example, it's a very rich symbol, thinking of its movement from the pre-linguistic natural order in which it is set to the verbal linguistic order of discourse. But we begin with the discourse of life, the force that will eventually meet the form and our hermeneutical uptake of the natural phenomenon. So the sun performs as this integral phenomenon of nature, but further lends itself as a locus of meaning making due to its central role in the solar system. Ricoeur goes so far as to identify the soul of interpretation stemming from the metaphor. And this is a quote from his book, The Rule of Metaphor, where Ricoeur says that the metaphor is living by virtue of the fact that it introduces the spark of imagination into a thinking more at the conceptual level. The struggle to think more, guided by the vivifying principle, is the soul of interpretation. We could say it's why we interpret. The discourse of life moves us to receive the force of life and allow it to take on form through interpretation. So thank you for your question, Imran. How does a religious community able to hold on to the oversaturation of meaning in religious symbols and metaphors generated by the given while still making judgments about what interpretations and practices should be orthodox in relation to them? The key word there, yes, is judgment. And when we use that term, we're outside the scope of phenomenology. So judgment depends on a metaphysical anchor of the is and is not, both literally and figuratively, but in a sense, definitively. So it's not that everything can mean whatever someone wants it to mean. It's not relativism within a religious context, but there's definition there's high definition of meaning in a religious context. Meanings are delineated one from another. We make distinctions within the context, so we're actually making sense of the truth as the whole in all of its respective parts. And it's a gathering up of these parts and relating them to one another and relating them ultimately to the whole of truth. So there is an oversaturation of meaning, but we come back to this via positiva, these cataphatic moments where doctrines are actually formulated, proclaimed, and enacted liturgically. So there's a saying in uh, Catholicism and Christianity, for example, in Latin, lex orandi, lex credendi. And this is why liturgy is a fascinating field for phenomenology, because there's so much going on in terms of manifestation and meaning. But this phrase in Latin, lex orandi, lex credendi, literally, the law of prayer is the law of belief. And so we have creeds. Every religious tradition has its respective creeds, or credo, the I believe. And so in the Catholic Church, for example, at every Sunday liturgy, we profess what's called the Nicene Creed, which was formulated by the gathering of bishops in the year 325, after the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity with his 313 Edict of Milan. And he asked the bishops to meet together to bring clarity to the doctrine, for the sake, and from his point of view, to bring political unity in the empire. It helped to be an adhesive in that respect. But for the church itself, this was a profitable moment, because the bishops gathered together in the authority of Christ by what is called in Christianity the power and inspiration of the Holy Spirit, one of the three persons of the Trinity, and comes with an articulation of faith that is definitive and perpetual. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible, as it goes on. And so, as a Catholic Christian in the 21st century, I can say the same creed that they said centuries ago and mean it in a unity of meaning. In a unity of meaning. And so there's a saturation of divine revelation, but a formal articulation, an expression that is of the manifestation interpreted, become meaning, become creedal meaning that is both spoken and enacted liturgically. So from the Greek liturgia, this work of this people of God who are unified in this faith. And so here we have a kind of harnessing of the saturation for productive meaning making. And it's the formulas of faith that put the faithful in contact with the actual mysteries of faith. So I hope that gets toward an answer of the question. But yeah, judgment is made, theological judgment, philosophical judgment. Catholicism relies so much on the heritage of Greek philosophy in these councils of Nicaea in 325, the councils of bishops in Constantinople in 381. And they're using Greek concepts to understand Jesus. The question, who is Jesus? Is Jesus divine? Is Jesus human? Is he some combination of both? And so when the bishops say Jesus is both God and man, two natures, phusein in Greek, yet one person, one hypostasis, one prosopon in Greek. They're using Greek it's language is the cosmopolitan language of the Mediterranean world at that time, and then it's translated into Latin, and so we have a coherent continuity and univocity of meaning within the polyphony of saturation of religious experience. So the meanings bring one to, we could say, into the sanctuary to receive all the meanings that give themselves. And yet there becomes a hierarchy of meaning in terms of the hierarchy of truths that is determined by authoritative judgments of the Pope and all the bishops around the world in union with the Pope. So in Catholicism, that's how this religious saturation works and gets moved into articulatable expressions. But still, much metaphor is involved. For example, in the creed we profess, we say Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, ascended into heaven, and is now seated at the right hand of the Father. There's a literal image there, as if Jesus is sitting on a cathedra, on a throne in heaven, wherever that is. But what's meant theologically is much more metaphorical than just this literal, he sits at the right hand of the Father. Even the word Father is referring to one of the persons of the Trinity is metaphorical. God is a father, yet is not a father per se, in terms of a creaturely father, a finite father. God is beyond sexual difference, as pure spirit and all this. But still, metaphor is used to approach God with a language that God has given through the course of his gradual progressive revelation. And so to say Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father is language of exaltation. He is risen from the dead, that his humanity has been introduced irrevocably into the inner life of the Trinity. If we're trying to be more philosophically precise, what does this metaphor mean? We could get there, but still we'll never tire of saying he's seated at the right hand of the Father, because the meaning is still meaning more than the attempt at a philosophical, prosaic reductionism of the metaphor to one meaning alone, or this attempted precise articulation of the meaning. Philosophical theology has its purpose, but it doesn't replace the centrality of the credo within the community. So this is a great question. But to continue here, thinking about the relationship between meaning and truth, thinking more through the metaphor, this struggle to think more. The metaphor lives insofar as it functions according to its abrasive, perturbing, yet life-giving, apophantic is not. With every metaphor, there's this play of the is and is not, the play of the copula between subject and predicate. Your love is a red rose, another example of metaphor. We're talking about as metaphors, especially used when it comes to the most saturating phenomena, like love, like time, like divinity, like sacrifice, like responsibility, that we're going to use poetic, we're going to move into poetic discourse. We're going to move into musical meaning making. I often wonder this question lately. What does music mean? What does the jazz standard Autumn Leaves mean? All these notes, the combinations of the notes, the timbres, the rhythms, the harmonies, the melodies, what does it mean? And we turn to music because it thinks more. It allows thought to think more, to remember more, to mean more than a glossary of words, an index of concepts. So music, art, poetry, still within linguistics, but we get a stretching of meaning, of thinking more. And the metaphor is very much functioning within poetry. So there's a power of negation within the assertion. And this is the fundamental principles of the metaphors, generativity. your love is a red rose, because your love is not literally a red rose. The metaphorical is generates to the extent that it resists univocity. To say time is a healer is to say at once time is not a healer. The power of the metaphor resides in its paradoxical nature, to mean two things simultaneously and more besides. As David Clem writes in his book, Hermeneutical Theory of Paul Ricoeur, the possibility of such self-recognition through poetic texts, for instance, depends on the efficacy of a logic of overturning and superabundance. So this is a big thing in Ricoeur's work. There's a logic of overturning, of saturation, of superabundance, which Ricoeur says is the logic of the metaphoric process itself, meaning discovered and created in the image formed when a kinship has been seen through contradiction. A kinship through contradiction is what we call paradox in phenomenology. And metaphors generate paradoxical meanings, and this is why they're so valuable to us. So in Imran's question, again, within a religious community, articulating through religious symbol and metaphor that was originally generated by this mysterium fascinans et tremendum and its saturating givenness, the mystery of divinity, we still make judgments and interpretation, yet maintain metaphorical discourse in doing so. So, to profess in the creed in Christianity, Jesus is now seated at the right hand of the Father. We don't try to convert all this into a more precise philosophical meaning. A theologian like Karl Rahner does this kind of thing, and there's a place for it, but we don't replace the Nicene Creed with a transcendental creed or something. It would be to miss the point and to miss the metaphorical genius of this credo. So, meaning and truth are disclosed through the metaphor to the degree that reading is characterized by suspension and openness. When we read a text, perhaps when we listen to someone speaking, we risk seeing as. We risk the as that comes with a novelty, that comes with the possibilities that I haven't yet reached. And it's as Marion puts it, the child opening her eyes to the morning. Think of the young child opening her eyes to the morning, and all of the delight and all the possibility that wells up for the child who has so much to experience in this life and gather up all of the givenness in this life. So philosophy, as adults, how can we open our eyes to the morning like the young child, to see as according to this new text, or maybe a very old text, maybe a text we've read thousands of times, but we come back to it with that bracketing of the natural attitude and this openness of interpretation and receptivity, not only to givenness, but also to meaning making. This is a real joy within the field of theology. There's so much meaning to be made in theology. There's so much meaning to be received and responded to. Thereby, the traditional phenomenological notion of es gibt becomes modified es gibt als, as I said earlier in this stream. The ellipsis, the ... is important here as it connotes dynamic and open-ended possibility instead of a static and already decided actuality. Toward the end of his book, The Rule of Metaphor, Ricoeur reproves Heidegger for submitting what he calls a determined ontology, in which the neutral appears more expressive than the personal, and in which the granting of being at the same time assumes the form of something destined. This ontology proceeds from a listening turned more attentively to the Greeks than the Hebrews, Ricoeur says of Heidegger, more to Nietzsche than to Kierkegaard. So be it, he says. It is appropriate that we, in turn, be attentive to this ontology without soliciting it. Wow, so there's a critique Ricoeur has of Heidegger, that he appreciates Heidegger, but what he finds lacking in Heidegger's philosophy is the personal and a really open horizon that proceeds beyond ontology, if not with ontology, next to it, nearby. So for Heidegger, this hermeneutical matrix that is established also brings its limitations. The self-manifestation of Sein through Seiendes, being through beings, through phenomena, received by Dasein, has its limitations, and Ricoeur finds it rather impersonal, Heidegger's philosophy, rather solitary, non-dialogical, impersonal, and predestined. That's interesting to think about Heidegger. His philosophy is predestined, that all we get is the self-manifestation of Sein. What about beyond that? That's where philosophy has to go next. That's where the history of phenomenology has to go next. And it does so with Ricoeur, Levinas, and Marion. And now us. Yes? So Ricoeur also asserts that for Heidegger, the es gibt, the it gives, the givenness, is the key word that carries the mark of this determined ontology. What is Ricoeur's ultimate aim in attending to Heidegger's ontology without soliciting it, without promoting it as is? That's a good pun intended. The clue is given in the conclusion of his book, The Rule of Metaphor, as Ricoeur esteems speculative thought as that which, he says, bases its work on the dynamism of metaphorical utterance, which it construes according to its own sphere of meaning. The sphere of meaning established by the metaphor and the variety of the multiplicity of metaphors that we encounter within lived experience. We have many more metaphors to consider than that of Sein and Dasein. Ricoeur in the end points to the power of poetic discourse and locates its dynamism in its primordial and hidden dialectic. And here's a quote also from The Rule of Metaphor. Ricoeur says that the dialectic that reigns between the experience of belonging as a whole and the power of distanciation that opens up the space of speculative thought. So for the philosopher, we don't want to be swallowed up in what Heidegger would call the chatter of the mass of people. And even for Ricoeur, as he validates the longing to belong, he says this experience of belonging cannot turn ideological, essentially. That we don't want to end up with a manipulation of truth, but by the power of distanciation in relation to the text, in relation of each one of us to the truth as truth, we don't cash out into the ideological surd, the ideological strongholds. Even the question brought up yesterday, the Nietzsche will to power. We don't shove everything under this rubric of power or of pleasure with Freud or of matter or possessions with Marx. We learn from the thinkers, but we don't reduce the whole hermeneutical project to one size fits all thoughts and experiences. So there continues to be the paradox of the definitive play of truth vis-a-vis each one of us. We are nestled within a community of interpreters, and yet each one of us has to decide. Each one of us has to respond. Each one of us has to make a judgment as to what I believe. Credo in unum Deum. Speculative thought for Ricoeur is none other than that signified by the expression seeing as. In speculative thought, we dare to see as, which means um, there's this unfolding, burgeoning of meaning in the risk of seeing as, which recognizes the potency of meanings in all discourse and leaves room for possibility within all inquiry. Again, it is the philosophical questions that lead by the hand, a kind of metaductio, the seeing as. The question moves the thought to see more than it saw before. Speculative thought inhabits the virtual space of investigation, wherein hypothesis, risk, and dialectic create an ever expanding horizon for thinking. As Ricoeur says, so once more the task of speculative discourse is to seek after the place where appearing means generating what grows. The flowers of our words, Worte wie Blumen in German, utter existence in its blossoming forth. So the more that we philosophize, the more that we speak, the more that we sing, the more that we compose poetry and art, the more blossoms bloom for thought. And we must gather up our rosebuds while we may, to quote the poet, in this respect, not in an immature, irresponsible, YOLO life worldview. You only live once. Not in this idea that I'd rather regret the things I did than regret the things I didn't do. Not in some irresponsible approach to the world that's very selfish, consumeristic, myopic, in the end destructive. The proof is in the pudding. What Ricoeur is talking about in these blossoms of words is the virtuous patience of the philosopher to think toward the whole in order to live toward the whole, where sin is a cancellation of possibility. So, for religious experience, the concept of sin, of vice, the problem is not that it's giving something that's competing with possibility, with new possibilities. What's meant by the term is an amputation of possibility. And that is undercooked philosophy. So, speculative thought, we have this dialectic, an ever expansive horizon of thought that does not rule out the possibility of finding satisfactory or even definitive answers. Ricoeur writes, again in The Rule of Metaphor, dialectic provides us with a universal technique of questioning without concern for man's ability to answer. But man would not pose questions if he had no hope in answering them. For this reason, the absence of prospective resolution required by the neutral character of the art of dialectic is one thing. The actual incompletion of a project that by definition includes the very prospect of its accomplishment is something else again. And it's the latter that Ricoeur is advocating. So it's a challenge for he's challenging skepticism directly here. Skepticism is where there's overall an absence of prospective resolution required by the neutral character of the art of the dialectic. That there's no hope in getting answers. There's only raising questions, raising questions. This is not what Ricoeur means with this rule of metaphor and this hermeneutical phenomenology, but what he's getting at is the actual incompletion of a project that by definition includes the very prospect of its accomplishment. So in this life, we don't come to the end. of the labyrinth of language. We find ourselves somewhere in the middle, in the metaxis, between beginning and end, because every point we may come to an end is a new turn, a new beginning in this drama of the hermeneutical quest for meaning and truth. Such sentiments resonate with Ricoeur as he makes recourse to dialectic without foregoing the quest for meaning, which which one is compelled to live and even die in this quest for meaning. We could ask ourselves, what meaning woke me up this morning? What meaning sustains me in the middle of the day? What meaning do I fall asleep to at night? What meaning motivates me beyond all others? What meaning might I even be willing to die for? That is worth. That is worth the quest. So finally, just a couple points. To round out this brief investigation of the symbol and the metaphor in Ricoeur's thought, language is the vehicle that mediates meaning. For the symbol, in effect, he says, only gives rise to thought if it first gives rise to speech. And so Ricoeur, he says there is no problem with this force becoming form. This is the route where force lights up in linguistic expression. It is in the metaphorical linguistic aspect of the symbol that language, Ricoeur says, captures the foam on the surface of life, the effervescence of that discourse of life, where expression creates being. One would not be able to meditate in a zone that preceded language. And in the rule of metaphor, quoting from Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space, 1958 text, Ricoeur quotes him saying, Bachelard, the essential newness of the poetic image poses the problem of speaking being's creativeness. Through this creativeness, the imaging consciousness proves to be very simply but very purely an origin. The imaging consciousness is an origin of the meaning making too. It's the other pole of things in relation to the givenness of the phenomenon, the manifestation of the phenomenon. In a study of the imagination, a phenomenology of the poetic imagination must concentrate on bringing out this quality of origin in various poetic images. And then through distanciation, there's the double place of origin between the author and his or her intention through the text and the meaning they intend through the text, but in the receptivity of the readers or listeners' meaningful uptake of the text. So that both the author and the reader are each their own pole of meaning making. But the meaning that is made is still going back to Husserl of a universal quality. Each meaning has its own univocity within this plurality of expressions. So it's not drifting into relativism or the ubiquity of meaning, but it's still maintaining distinctive meanings that altogether mean what they signify. Mean what you say and say what you mean. So Ricoeur, for him, there is no symbolism before man speaks, even if the power of the symbol is grounded much deeper. It is in language that the cosmos, desire, and the imaginary reach expression. Through language, bundles all of these together, brings them into conversation. Speech is always necessary if the world is to be recovered and made hierophany, he says, a manifestation of the sacred. Speech is necessary for this to happen. In his book, Interpretation Theory, Ricoeur writes that there is no need to deny the concept in order to admit that symbols give rise to an endless exegesis. If no concept can exhaust the requirement of further thinking borne by symbols, this idea signifies only that no given categorization can embrace all the semantic possibilities of a symbol. But it is the work of the concept alone that can testify to this surplus of meaning. So this again goes back to Imran's question, even within a religious context. We have a saturating semiotics of meaning in which judgments are made by the interpreting authority of the community to make the definitive creedal doctrines, um, to define them for the community gradually. And even within Catholicism, for example, there's the concept of the development of doctrine. So we can point to the same reality through different kinds of expression, especially in new historical cultural contexts, in which an expression from hundreds of years ago may not mean exactly what it did then for us now. And so there needs to be ongoing updating, reformulating of expression without denying the, again, univocity of the realities themselves. So it's not nominalism where we're recreating reality through the language we use to name it, but it's also letting the saturating content of reality come into logical and conceptual form through language, through discourse, through communication, which is necessary to, again, know and understand a thing intellectually. But what Ricoeur is saying here is that the concept itself testifies to the surplus of meaning which it cannot contain, but only signify and point to. That is very important to prevent us from falling into literal fundamentalism. There actually are many ways to say something to point to the same reality. And we do more justice to the reality, especially when it is a mysterious one, when our meanings proliferate, especially when we're talking about divinity. This must be the case. Then in the Hermeneutics and Human Sciences, Ricoeur says the linguistic sign can stand for something only if it is not the thing. Okay, so in semiotics, we have signs that point to things, concepts that point to percepts, language that points to phenomena. In this respect, the sign possesses a certain negativity. Every semiotic sign does this. The sign is not the thing, it's a pointer. Now, when we get into the logic of symbol, though, this is beyond the phenomenality of sign, that itself is not the thing. In a symbol, you can have these two universes, two dimensions intersecting, and the thing actually is giving it through the symbol, not just as sign, but as a unity of the manifestation and the meaning. And this is the Christian notion of sacrament, the invisible manifest and proclaimed in the visible elements. So it's more than symbol per se, it's sacrament, which means divinity is giving itself through the finitude of matter and form. Signifiers, but a channeling of the one in and through the other to the recipient. So a pregnancy of meaning that is bearing the other in the same. We could say it's the meaning of prophecy, for example, in Judaism and Islam, where we have bearing the word of the other within the same and communicating that. But the sign at least brings us to the threshold of the symbol through the positivity and negativity functioning in the sign. It points to the thing itself is not. Everything that happens, Ricoeur says, as if in order to enter the symbolic universe, the speaking subject must have at his disposal an empty space from which the use of signs can begin. So the epoche, the phenomenological reduction, is the virtual event, the imaginary act, which inaugurates the whole game by which we exchange signs for things and signs for other signs. Even what Derrida calls différence, this play, this semiotic play of the signs. But we're still getting somewhere. We're not locked in a room with no exit. We're moving, following the breadcrumbs of the signs to the thing itself, back to Husserl. Phenomenology, Ricoeur says, is like the explicit revival of this virtual event, which it raises to the dignity of the act, the philosophical gesture. Again, the phenomenological reduction, the epoche, the intentional bracketing of any kind of reductionistic way of thinking that would limit the semiotic play of the signs, the symbols, the metaphors, the analogies, and the sacramental inbreaking of divinity in the end. So this epoche, this phenomenological reduction, reduces the natural attitude, which is to say reduces every reductionism that would prevent the play of the manifestation and the meaning of lived experience. The reduction renders thematic what was only operative and thereby makes meaning appear as meaning. This is why we can call phenomenology, in one sense of the term, the science of meaning. Meaning given and meaning made. So Ricoeur helps us, again, a lot of these excerpts from my 2017 book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist. I just love unpacking this with you. And so Ricoeur helps us think about this hermeneutical phenomenology that complements Husserl, Heidegger, and Marion's phenomenology of manifestation and givenness. Thank you for your question again here, Imran. So for Kant, judgments of taste are universal, so far as we believe others ought to share them, even though they aren't conceptual judgments about objects. Is an analogous shared aesthetic sensibility required for a religious community to symbols and metaphors? Yes, I think that's a great way to put it. So an aesthetic sensibility, a unified aesthetic sensibility, is required for the religious community to share the same semiotics, the same symbolic order of meaning, the same play and function of the symbols and metaphors within that specified religious context. It's a very powerful communal act of professing the credo together, professing the creed together. If someone says, I don't assent to this formulation of faith, I don't say it, I don't profess it, then they don't enter into that fold of the womb of meaning there in, we say, the church. They stay outside by choice, by their own judgment. But if someone says, yes, I believe, yes, I assent to divinity, to the divinity's revelation, not only universally and generically, but particularly, for example, in Christianity, through Jesus Christ as the fullness of the self-revelation of God. And I assent to all the specificity and particularity and aesthetic order of this self-revelation of God. The word aesthetic, I agree with that, but at the same time, I think aesthetics is a careful term because we also get into personal preference kind of things within the territory of aesthetics. So someone might prefer one type of liturgical music over another, but the whole traditio of the faith involves a whole multitude of expressions. Gregorian chants, and contemporary musical composition, and the authority of the church gives the guidelines for what would be acceptable liturgical music, but so does custom within a place. of a local community and culture. So in Catholicism, there's inculturation, where the gospel from the beginning is a translatable message, a message that's meant to be enculturated into a variety of cultures throughout the world. And I think we see this in Christianity, most of all among world religions, where there's this thick, rich historical process of enculturation, where there can be, again, a polyphony, an aesthetic polyphony across cultures. So you don't have to have a cultural conversion in the sense, or an ethnic conversion or something, to enter the church. The church, by definition, in terms of Catholicism, is multicultural and involves the whole of the global church, in which aesthetics is harmonious and symphonic. So that's also part of things in actual Catholicism, though a lot of people may have a kind of reduction going on according to their personal preferences, and that can get in the way of all of the meaning giving itself in a global way, um, in the history of the church and the multicultural reality of the church of Catholicism. But there does have to be some universal assent in terms of the essentials. So I may not call them in terms of the aesthetic sensibility, but I might call them more in terms of the logical coherence of the faith in its creedal formulation. That's the sine qua non for unity in the community. Not so much an aesthetic preference, but nevertheless, there's always aesthetics. There's something aesthetic about the credo itself. But it's what is of the intellect. It's two things, as Thomas Aquinas would say, primarily when we're talking about what is of the essence of the tradition of faith, the intellect and the will. And for Christianity, it's knowledge, the intellectual knowledge of the content of faith, what the Catholicism calls the sacred deposit of faith, that is expressed through the sensus fidelium, the sense of all the faithful around the world. So it's an intellectual assent to the content of faith. That's central, primary. But also alongside it is the voluntary, not just desire, but will to love for Christianity. The gospel of Jesus is the gospel of love, merciful love. And so to remain united within this community of faith, there's intellectual assent and volitional love, the will to love. So it's not just Gnosticism. That was a heresy in the early centuries of the church, where as if the faith can be reduced to knowledge content, gnosis in Greek. But likewise, it's not just a kind of affective unity either. And it's not just good intentions either. It's the combination of living the truth in love. Yeah, thank you, Imran, for this question too. How does sin amputate possibility with respect to all this? Well, I would say, for instance, with Jean-Luc Marion and his concept of the erotic phenomenon, love grants possibility. Love signifies the opening of possibility. We could say to the most saturating degree, in as much as Marion argues, that the deepest question welling up within us from that discourse of life is, does anybody out there love me? And we ask the question, and so we find ourselves in this arena of love. In Christianity, at least the Judeo-Christian tradition, the theological concept of sin is a deprivation of love, a deprivation of goodness, therefore a deprivation of possibility. Because possibility actually is not something that is generic, neutral, and arbitrary. as Ricoeur is getting at here, possibility means a living into the more, not the less. Possibility signifies an expanse and dilation of horizon. And what we have with sin is a contraction, is a limitation of horizon. When a person sins, again, it's not something substantial in itself, but it's deciding in favor of an illusion. An illusion does not grant more possibility, it subtracts from it. So I could think I'm opening to some great possibility in this way. That's, again, what might be descriptively characteristic of sin, something very selfish, conceited, again, consumeristic, anything that degrades the person, degrades the other person, when I treat the other person like an object, which is false. Another human being, another human person is no material object. But when this is done in slavery, in sweatshops, in prostitution, in pornography, in just relationships, in exploitation of any kind in the workplace, we have sin. We have a subtraction of interpretation of the manifestation of the phenomenon that is giving itself. The personhood of the other, for example, the call of the other in Levinas. And so to fail in a precise interpretation is already an illusory failure of not bracketing the natural attitude. Moreover, when we have a thought, a word, a deed, an omission that is moving away from the expansion of possibility and actually subtracting from it, we have a contraction of horizon of interpretation. We have a contraction of meaning making. And sin always involves some phenomenality of idolatry, where it's a confusion of the part for the whole. And someone acts in such a way that they entirely misjudged the whole and reduced it to the part. So signified by Möglichkeit in German, a possibility, is the sense that we don't want to amputate the whole. And the whole is maintained, we could say, through love and responsibility in relation to it. So that's some things I might say about how is sin an amputation of possibility. I say more in my little book called Phenomenology, a basic introduction in the light of Jesus Christ about this concept of sin in relation to possibility, what's meant by it. But sin in a Heideggerian sense, not that he uses the term, but it would involve an inauthentication of the ownmost possibilities of Dasein and the appropriation of meaning. It becomes a kind of reductionism of meaning when it comes to sin. So it involves a closure rather than an opening. So thank you. If there's no more comments and questions for today, thank you for joining me on this live stream about Paul Ricoeur on meaning and metaphor. Very rich topic matter in the history of phenomenology. So thank you, as always, for joining me. May you continue to think toward the whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you on the next one.